Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Saints Talk, the last in this year's series. A very warm welcome to our alumni, students, parents, friends and colleagues who join us from around the globe this evening. My name is Pamela Stevenson. I'm Head of Development, London and International at the University of St Andrews. Throughout the course of the year, we've presented a number of Saints Talks, each given by an esteemed St Andrews academic colleague on a range of fascinating and stimulating topics. They provide a snapshot of the breadth and the depth of knowledge and expertise that St Andrews has to offer. Joining the series today is How Did I Come to Make Those Choices and What Should I Do Next? This is the intriguing title of this new presentation by Professor Paul Hibbert, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you all this evening. Paul is Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Divinity and Professor of Management here at the University. Amongst his illustrious appointments, he is also an Honorary Professor at the University of Auckland Business School and Editor-in-Chief of Academy of Management Learning and Education. His internationally recognised research is principally focused on collaborative, reflexive and relational processes of organising and learning. His work is published in leading international journals, and his book, How to Be a Reflexive Researcher, was published last month. Paul will speak for around 30 minutes, after which there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and I warmly encourage you to do so. You can submit your question at any time during Paul's presentation via the chat bar on the screen, and we aim to finish promptly by 6:15. Now, however, let's discover how we come to make our choices and what we should do next. Paul, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here, and it's nice to spend time with everyone here online who's joined us this evening. Thank you for coming along. So I've set this title up about how we make our choices and decide what to do next. Let me take you into the process of that, which is thinking about reflexive practice. I want to think about reflexive practice because not all of our decisions seem to be optimal. Perhaps you've taken a decision yourself sometimes that seemed to make no sense when you look back at it, or it could have been just a bit better than the choice that you made. Perhaps you've planned to eat healthily as a simple example, and yet you find there's that donut in your hand. How did that get there? I don't remember doing that. Anyway, I'm sure you are all very healthy eaters. It never happens to you. It might happen to me sometimes. On a more important or serious level, perhaps you have a life partner you're lucky enough to spend time with. You love them, you know them better than anyone else, and yet sometimes you still argue. How can that happen? You know them really well. So that's a bit confusing, isn't it? You should be able to prevent arguments happening. Unless, of course, something else is going on. Perhaps we aren't always the smart people we think we are. Perhaps our common sense isn't always in charge. Our well-informed minds aren't the only things involved in making our decisions. Something else is going on that's having an influence in the way we act, the decisions we make, and how we interact with other people. And that's really at the heart of reflexive practice, is getting at what's going on there, looking at the influences on our decisions and our judgments that come from our bodies, our emotions, our rational mind, and our connection to others, our relationality. So our bodies involve internal signals of what's going on in them. Sometimes when you say you feel something in your gut, you really do. Our emotions can sometimes surprise us when we're not expecting them. Sometimes you might cry at a sad film and wonder why you're doing that without really having unpacked it. Our rational mind seems to be in charge a lot of the time, but often we don't know everything. We can't really know everything there is to know about a situation. We're limited from our background and our upbringing. I'll come to unpack that a little bit more later on. And we have some influences from others on our thinking that are people we trust, or sometimes people that surprise us with new ideas that we didn't expect. And I'm going to take you through all of those things in more detail through this talk. Let me start by thinking more about our bodies. I'm going back to a very old experiment here done by Dutton and Aaron many years ago. I don't think they'd be able to do this experiment these days, but anyway, this is what they did. They had some young men cross a shaky high suspension bridge across a gorge, something like this, but a bit more frightening even. Or they had people across the same gorge by a stable modern platform bridge. So had people go across one of these two situations, an experiment. And they found at the end of that experience, they placed a researcher who ask them some neutral questions about the location, their experience. The researcher will be saying, well, how was it crossing that bridge, whether it's the shaky one or the stable one? What do you think about this environment? You know, would you have other people come in? Neutral questions. Then they were met by a second researcher who asked these young men about their encounter with the first researcher, who was a young woman. And the men who'd been across the shaky suspension bridge, the kind of slightly scary one, were more likely to think that the young woman might have an interest in them, which is a kind of strange setup. Their body's kind of primed already. They've had a kind of alert making experience. And they feel differently about themselves than that rather neutral, safe situation, which is a bit surprising and kind of disappointing if you're a guy, actually, that you're that easily swayed by an experience. But it's an interesting experiment nonetheless. Shows how our bodily experiences are affecting us without even coming to the level of an emotion we're aware of. But we can still be affected by emotions too that go beyond bodily experience. Now, emotions can be powerful in many ways, and they surprise us, they creep up on us when we're not expecting. And lots of research has been done about negative emotional experiences and the way in which those can impact on us. So you will have seen perhaps lots of work yourselves about people whose emotional experience have been very, very difficult, like traumatic experiences in war situations or in situations of violence, or people dealing with very difficult situations recently in hospital and healthcare contexts too. So difficult emotional experience can affect people in those situations not only at the time, but long after. That's most obvious in post-traumatic stress disorder. That's how these things come about. There's no oversimplification. There's some good books to read on that if you're more interested. But what I've found in my recent research with colleagues is that even less extreme negative emotional experiences can be associated with a kind of feedback loop and keep coming back to bite us in the same way. You don't have to have PTSD to have a kind of lock-in of a negative emotional experience. So an emotional experience can affect you there at the time, before you know what's going on, before you're getting to the idea of thinking about something rationally, or it can surprise you later on and come back when you're maybe trying to think rationally about something else. But emotions don't necessarily just affect us if they're negative. They can have some interesting effects also if they're positive. So I like this photograph here of a young person. I'll talk more about the photo in a second. But we found in our research that we confirmed the research of others that positive emotions, especially hope, were important too. Hope can help people to find a way of being in the most challenging circumstances. And it's very important for enabling life-changing decisions in the most difficult context. So this photograph, I said I would come back and talk about a bit more, is a Syrian refugee. I just love the kind of optimistic, upward look on her face, and you can almost sense the hope. And I think that must be something that refugees somehow cling to in their difficult and frightening journeys. There's some kind of positive prospect at the end that keeps them going till they find a place of safety, comfort and welcome, hopefully, at the end of their journey. But certainly those two kinds of emotion then can have powerful effects on us. So we've got the immediate negative emotion, the negative emotion that's held back and comes and hits us later, or positive emotions that driving us forward, even though rationally the situation might look untenable. If you're a refugee in terrifying situations, then rationally it's hard to see how you're going to make it through, and yet people still do with that effective emotion. Let's think then, moving on to the idea of rationality and relationality. Here I'm thinking about the ways in which we are affected by our own thinking, and the way in which we use our own thinking to make our decisions and judgments, and the ways in which we interact with other people in the context of doing that. So first of all, oops, wrong button. I was bound to do that at least once. I'm glad I've done it now. Rational behaviours don't always match our expectations. So we may think we have all the good knowledge we need for a situation. Here's an organisational context in the picture here. A meeting with computers, very rational. What could look more rational than a meeting and computers? Well, quite a lot of other things. But anyway, here's the situation. So we've got everything we need to understand what's going on. Perhaps we've been in the organisation for a long time, and so we can make decisions there with some confidence. But the effects of our context and formation are built in and shape what we see as normal. So we have a certain education, we have a certain upbringing, and these have an effect on what we see and understand. And that's why people often focus on diversity, to stretch our thinking about that. And we are influenced also by trusting relationships in a particular context. If you're in any large working environment, you will find situations in which you rely on more voices of certain people than other voices. And sometimes that's a good thing because you can save time by just trusting a few close contacts. And sometimes it's a bad thing by shutting out voices that could give you a different and useful perspective and shake up things in a positive way. So as an example of that, here's a quote from some earlier research I did looking at managers' experience of being in organisations and trying to unpack their own experiences. And that said, this is a senior manager in an organisation. She said, "I gossiped with the right people about the wrong people. I sneered at those who did not conform to the cultural norms of what was expected of high achievers within the organisation. I did all this, and I was not concerned by my behaviour. After all, I thought, very effective in my role." You can see the way in which that limited conceptualisation there has come about. I'm doing the right things. I'm getting a good career. It must be okay. These other people are telling me it's okay, but I'm doing bad things, and later I come to regret it. And this was her experience of relating this in a class on reflexive practice that I had that was part of a research study that I did. So you can see all the ways in which our rational framework going into situations constrained, and also sometimes having people who give us different views doesn't always help, but it can, and I'll come to ways in which it can a little later. But what I want to take us into the prospect of is that being more aware in or of our decisions can be helpful and help us to make better choices. To do that, we have to be aware of the reflexive practices, those kind of 4 levels of body, emotion, rationality and relationality, and how they can help us. So I want to talk through reflexive practice as it involves embodied interoception. Interoception refers to the ways in which we're aware of what's going on in our body when we feel that tension in our gut, or when we feel our heart beating faster. Emotional perception, how we experience emotions that are positive or negative and the way that impacts us before we get to rational thought. Then going on to rational thought through the idea of apperception. Apperception is a really interesting word. It means really a kind of incomplete understanding. And from my perspective of my research, all of our understandings are always incomplete. There's always a side we can never know. There's always another view that can add to our understanding of what's going on. And from that, you get into the linked process of contextualization and conceptualization. So we have an experience, we read what's going on, we look into our memory banks without thinking about it deliberately, we find something similar, and that's how we describe it. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And that description is semi-automatic. And then also think about the level of relational reception and resolution. Sometimes in contact with others, we get ideas that are easy to accept, especially if we agree with them straight off. And sometimes we think, I don't know about that. We have to have a conversation about that before I can work out how it fits in to my framework and I can make it useful. And through being aware of those practices, we can build a process and use it to have a better understanding of ourselves and the way in which we act and take our decisions. But before I get to that, I want to clear up a small detail about the difference between reflective or reflexive. So you've probably read and seen a lot about reflective practice. Reflective practice is about finding better solutions to problems. I've got a problem in my organisation about how I motivate staff, or I'm interested in how I can enact my leadership practice better, or I'm trying to solve this financial problem. I find a better tool, a way of solving that problem. It doesn't make me think differently about myself, whereas reflexive practice is trying to do something else. It's building on our human capacity for adapting in response to experience. So it involves really a shift in your pattern of thinking and or being or doing. You're literally changing your mind, and you therefore think differently in the future. And that can be deliberate or automatic. It can be automatic because we always change as we go through life anyway. As you develop a relationship with someone, if you have a life partner, your thinking and understanding moves on over time, and the way in which you act together changes automatically. You're going to grow together. That can be kind of cheesy about it, but it can also be deliberate. But deliberate reflexive practice is less familiar for most people. Most people need some encouragement or need some help, and including me, to get engaged with these levels of reflexive practice deliberately. So what does that involve? So I'm going to go through the levels of reflexive practice and what's involved in grasping them one by one at this time. So thinking first of all about interoception, this awareness of our bodily experiences, feeling things in your gut, your heart is racing. Experience occurs directly through our bodies. We've been across that shaky bridge and my heart's beating faster. Okay, that's happening without me having to think about it. And our bodies respond in that way. But it's possible to cultivate an awareness of bodily sensations through this process of interoception, paying attention to those internal signals and consider their effects on ourselves and others. You might surprise their effects on others. I'll come to that in a moment, but effects on ourselves. So it's natural for me, for example, when I start a presentation like this with lots of interesting people, hopefully at the end, engaging with what I'm saying, to feel a little bit anxious. And so I'm aware my heart rate will go up a little bit. Now, because I'm aware of that, it doesn't bother me. But if I wasn't aware of it, it could affect me in ways I'm not really so cognizant of, and might set me up to be a little more anxious continuing. Because I know it's going to happen, it's okay. But there are also effects on others, because we can project outward signals from our internal signals. So if you have anxiety, sometimes that shows in your face. If you have a shock, you can have the blood drain from your face. It becomes obvious to others, and so it has an impact on what happens in the situation, the context. I did some great work with Ben Hardy in describing how this happens and has an effect, and he's done lots of great work on this kind of situation with financiers, amongst others, looking at how their internal states have an impact on them. But being aware of these internal states, research has shown, has an interesting side effect. If we're more aware of our own internal states, we can be more aware of emotional signals in others that are related to them. So we develop a double level of awareness through paying attention to ourselves. That then moves me to this level of emotional reflexive practice, thinking about our perceptions, the way these emotions hit us. So interacting with people and the environment, often there's an emotional response first before we think about it. If you see somebody hurt or in pain or grieving, you're probably going to get an emotional reaction without having to think about it. That's natural and normal. But what you need to do is think about the way in which you spot those perceptions and consider how they proceed and affect our thinking. So if I have something that's maybe enter a state of anxiety or low mood, being aware of it can make me think about how I react thereafter. So if I'm feeling anxious, like at the start of a talk, it's natural for me. I think actually I'll spot everything that's negative and worry about it. But that's just a side effect, so I don't need to worry about that so much. So I know my judgment's a bit off in that regard. So being aware of how they affect our thinking is an important reason for paying attention to emotions. And emotion is not necessarily a bad thing. If you're sad without knowing why, or shocked without knowing why, something's going on in the situation you should pay attention to and need to unpack it later. So it's a signal sometimes that you need to be more aware of what's going on. So sometimes you have these emotions, you can't work out what's happening, frustrated. Well, that's okay. Don't let it distract you perhaps forever, but be aware there's something to come back to in that situation to think about later and try and unpack perhaps with friends. And I'll come to an example of that later on. So be aware the emotion isn't just a distraction, it's telling you something's going on, it's worthwhile thinking about it. So you process it later. But then we can move on to think about rational reflexive practice. And that involves this idea of our perception. That's the kind of incomplete, imperfect understanding. So thinking about the ways in which we contextualize, we examine experience through what we already know. So the situateness of the individual here. So I'm thinking about an example here. Let's talk about, for example, if I was to offer you some tea, or even better, if you were to offer me some tea. Here in Scotland, if you offered me tea, I expect a nice hot drink with a bit of milk in it, no sugar, thank you very much, that'd be very lovely. If I was in the southern United States and you offered me tea, I would expect a cold drink with lots of sugar in it. Now, I didn't know that the first time I went to the southern United States. It's a slight shock. So sometimes your contextualization limits what you understand by even a simple word like tea. And so imagine how much different it can be for very complex contexts, complex concepts that other people might understand differently. So the way in which you contextualize something leads very quickly to the way in which you conceptualize it, what you expect and how you react. So my first time at lunch, I'm saying yes to tea before I know it's a cold, sweet drink. So that's one decision I didn't make again. I went for coffee instead. So important to think about this rational level and the way in which our understanding is incomplete and being aware of that. And what we're trying to do with this rational level is think about how we can get in between that contextualization, that conceptualization. I realize that I'm reading from a limited experience and I wonder whether in my new situation that limited experience will be enough, or do I need to stop and ask some questions? A good example of this rational contextualization limit is in the film 12 Angry Men, when you've got a jury, and if you look at this jury, they're very similar people. They're all of one gender, they're all of one particular community, and only one person has a different idea about the outcome of the trial than the others, and the others are very angry for that reason, but the other person persists. But what that really is showing us there, that the trouble we have when all the kind of voices we have aren't interrupting our own rational conceptualization, that we're locked into the same kind of worldview, and we're not aware there's something else that might be worth thinking about. So it leads us into that need to consider that level of relational engagement, level of relational dialogue. So to get into that relational level, we think about reception and resolution. So we're thinking about the communicational actions of others that we receive as different but meaningful. So, you know, when somebody gives a different idea or presents us with that different drink for tea that we didn't expect, what's going on here? I need to unpack that. Is a very simple example, but they can be much more complex ideas than that. But the important thing about it is what's received may have an impact that is not clear to us and need to be resolved through dialogue or other layers of reflexive practice. What I mean by there is sometimes it's okay to ask yourself when you receive an unfamiliar message, oh, I'm feeling a bit shocked by that. There's something here I don't understand, so I need to have a conversation about it. Other layers, other signals that we have tell us something's going on. And often dialogue with people is the best way of unpacking that. So somebody gives you a shocking interpretation, it's worth asking them why they feel that way, or having a conversation about it more generally. It's an invitation to learn something new about your own understanding, whether it's complete enough. So perhaps we're having a conversation with somebody and we might be saying something like, well, you know, that guy keeps chatting to me all over this conference. He's just, I think, setting out to bug me. He's always got some little polite comment to make, and he's just obviously trying to irritate me. And my friend says, do you think it might be that he likes you instead? That kind of simple flipping of an idea to a different context is worth thinking about. There can be much more radical surprises than that happen in conversation, but always the benefit comes to us most of all if we're prepared to entertain views that are very different from our own, at least for a while, and try and resolve them. Doesn't mean to say the other person is always right. It's to say instead, we should always first of all think about what if the other person is right, or what if there's some new understanding that's better built by both of our understandings working together in a new way. So think about how we engage with what's offered to us in dialogue that shocks us. If we can do that, we can start to build up to a kind of productive cycle that we can work with our reflexive practice in ways that we find useful for our future decision making, our future interpretation and action. So if we are aware of our bodily situation, our interoception, the signals we're getting, if we're aware of our emotions and how we generally respond emotionally in situations, if we think about our own upbringing, the limits of our context that means for us, what I don't know from not having been to other places or have different educational experiences, for example, as somebody who is a professor of management, is my understanding to be different from a professor of physics? Yes, it is. Always. There are different ways in which those things play out, and also thinking about the ways in which the different conversation opportunities we've had, different ways to be influenced by others, all of this has shaped our interpretations coming to any situation that we face. And it's a powerful thing to be aware of our limitations and our situateness and our contextual constraints in that way. Then we have the opportunity of an enriched, future-oriented reflexive practice. That means to say, knowing I am limited in these ways and built up and constrained in a certain way, I can think about what's happening when it's important to do so. Now, I'm not suggesting here that you try and operate full reflexive practice all the time. That'd be quite draining. But what I am suggesting is that you may encounter a situation where you recognise something is different and I should stop and think more carefully and slowly here before I take the decision if I've got the opportunity. That's the future-oriented reflexive practice. Think about how I use all those signals, all those levels to decide what I will do next. If you do that, that gives in some results in terms of changing our understandings. So we get new knowledge, new insights. Our interactions with people will change because we're more thoughtful in those interactions. And also we get different self-development. We begin to change our mind, which is the purpose of engaging in this kind of process, to put together our contextualization, our frameworks in a different way that might be more useful or productive for us. And that then stimulates past-oriented reflexive practice. Now I've come to a new understanding of myself and how I engage through this process, I can now look back at my background in a different way. I can then understand better my situators, my limits and my constraints and my abilities and my positive possibilities and the ways in which my emotions and my bodily signals are useful to me. But I understand that more richly through going around this cycle, and it ends up being a virtual circle in this way. So what does that mean then for the ways in which that builds to practical interactions in the environment in which we work in organisations? I've got a few slides to take you through here about those implications. So from my recent research, looking at learning and leading, it's really about thinking about emotions, first of all, for me, as being the understudied area of attention in those kinds of fields. So in my research with colleagues, we found, for example, that unsurprisingly, negative emotional experiences lead us into some immediate reflexive awareness. If you have a very strong negative emotion, you are going to pay attention to it. You won't walk past grief, sadness, fright. You'll be aware of it and you'll pay attention. It might distract you actually from everything else that's going on at the time. But what then normally happens? Do we then spend time dwelling on that? No. We're all engaged in a context where normally we're trying to get something done, or we want to relate to people and carry on with normal life. So we try and contain it. Our next reflexive practice rationally is to look into our mind, say, emotion bad, let me put that away and switch to rational thinking instead, to contextualizing, conceptualizing, thinking about it in a rational frame, pack it away, leave the emotion to one side. But what then happens is we get to work through a little loop here. Some stressful condition happened in which we remember that difficult emotional experience. It comes back and bites us again. So in some of the research I've written, we talk about difficult experiences in organisations, and we recognise a similar situation in which something went wrong and we react very badly to it. You can see this happening perhaps in your own organisational context, when people sometimes seem to back away from a situation. It's set an emotional trigger for them, but of course nobody wants to live with this kind of loop of just avoiding something because it reminds us of a negative emotion, triggers that emotion again, and leads us to push it down. Instead, we found that the work of getting past that involved saying it's okay to have emotion, first of all, to leave it on the table and to think about it, but to think about it in a supportive context. So to work on emotions with trusted other friends you can talk through your emotional experience with. And we call that the reflexive practice of dialoguing. It's like that reflexive practice of reception and resolution. I offer my account of an emotional experience, and sometimes actually, I think what was going on in that situation was this, and you've missed this thing. And then we say, actually, that's quite useful. So now I've got some distance on it. I can see it differently. I can move to this top box there, you see, of realigning, and try and think, can I adjust my conceptual framework here? Can I contextualize differently? Can I add in some new knowledge that builds that understanding differently? And then change the way in which I'll interpret that kind of experience in the future. And if that's true, if that works for me, then there's some learning that's an outcome. And that learning can have implications for general ways of going about things or for leadership. So it can be about authenticity or effectiveness. Authenticity, because if we're able to live with our emotional experiences and handle them and process them and learn from them, we can be more comfortably ourselves, but also we can be effective in situations in which that happens and not be thrown off kilter by that to some extent. But more importantly than that, what we found was that you don't have to go through this very long loop of having an emotional experience, packing it down, containing it, opening it up, then going to speak to people, then realigning, then developing the learning. If you are practiced, if you become experienced in reflexive practice, there is a faster route. Once you have experience of attending to your thoughts, emotions, your bodily experiences, and the thoughts of others, then that can take you more quickly from attending to realigning. I have an emotional experience, it's powerful for me. That means I need to think about how I change my contextualization here. Something's happened. Emotions aren't always bad. It's telling me always, though, something's happened I should pay attention to. I enter into it with that realigning mindset. I still might need to talk to some other people, go into dialogue, but then I get to that outcome, that fruitful output of authenticity and effectiveness much more quickly than I would have done otherwise. So I hope that makes sense. Now, I dread presenting diagrams like this. I've tried to build it up slowly, but that's the overall benefit of it, that reflexive practice, that skill in engaging on those 4 levels gives you a faster route of working with experiences. And that doesn't just apply to emotional experience. It could apply to a bodily experience or a rational one, but being aware that when there's something difficult about it, that attending to it and working on it can be productive, but most powerfully for emotional experiences. That's how it applies really in the context of learning more generally, and in terms of applying it to leadership context, which is what a lot of my recent research has been about, looking at situations in organizations. But also this has implications not just for learning and leading and thinking about what we do in organizations, but for living more generally. And one of the primary outcomes for me as an academic, and the one I've written about in my book, slight plug, is that it's really about what it means to have a scholarly way of life. And I'm thinking always about how I change my mind and develop myself, and that's normal for somebody who's engaged in reflexive scholarship. So I expect to change. I expect my living to be shaped by engaging in reflexive practice going forward all the time. But for all of us, I don't necessarily expect everyone to want to engage in that level of constructive development of the thought and the theory. You're not going to want to do that. But I do think it gives you an opportunity to think about the influences in your decisions. So when you're in a situation where you do feel that something different is going on, or maybe you're not quite sure what to do, think about what's happening on those 4 levels and what you're going to do next. Thinking about whether there's something happening in your body, you're feeling something in your gut. Is there an emotional experience that's maybe distracting you and telling you need to pay more attention? Is your rational contextualization rich enough to cope with the situation? Is there somebody on hand you can have a dialogue with to explore different views about the situation, especially in moments that are important or pivotal for you? But what you will find, and this is my last thought really of the talk, is if you engage in that kind of reflexive practice, and if you're open to it, that more often than you expect, nothing will change unless you do, even when that's not the outcome you were hoping for. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for a really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation, particularly that last point. Nothing will change unless you do. Something for us all to think about there. And I'm really delighted to say that questions are popping into the chat bar as we speak. Really interesting that one of the first comments that we had, rather than a question, was somebody who's recognised the shaky bridge in the gorge. In New Zealand, so just testament to how well travelled and how global St Andrews alumni are and colleagues around the world. So if that was you, thank you for sharing that thought with us. So as I say, we have some questions popping in. May I throw some of them at you for your learned consideration?
Well, please, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. Well, just to start, here's one from Nicole. Are your ideas based on behaviourism?
No, not necessarily, Nicole. The ideas are drawn together from many sources. My most useful sources have been 2 researchers, one of whom I've worked with a lot, Anne Cunliffe, who's done lots of foundational work on reflexivity in organisational contexts, but also from Margaret Archer, who has approached this from a sociological context. And the interesting thing about this, the reason why I love those 2 particular sources, they're from completely different philosophical camps, and you'd never normally find them on the same page. But I like the fact that my reflexive practice insists that I'm open to both those different views. But it's really coming from sociological views of organisations most of all. I come from a particular perspective, but behaviourism would have something to say about this, Nicole. So that's an interesting angle and a useful question. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Another interesting question, I don't know who's posted this, it's anonymous. Have you seen examples of this thinking being used in the field of criminology?
Oh, well, no, I've never looked at that field, but I can see it could be very, very interesting, actually, thinking about the motivations of people involved in certain kinds of behaviours and what we might learn from that, and also how we might help people think about rehabilitation from crime. I think it's a useful way of understanding what happens to people when they are emotionally disturbed in situations. And that happens in a lot of crime situations. So I think that's an area of application and perhaps an area where I might look at some research in the future. Thank you.
Terrific. Just one point to note. Somebody was asking if your presentation will be available on after we're finished, and it will be on our alumni YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that everybody gets the details about that. So do look out for that later. Something which I'm particularly interested in was about the 4 kinds that you were talking about: embodied, emotional, rational, and relational. Which is the most difficult kind of reflexive awareness to manage, and why is that?
I think that will vary for different people. They'll have different experiences of how that feels and works for them. I found that the most difficult one for most people that I've talked with and worked with in this area has been the emotional one, because they do just grab us, first of all, and so powerful. And if you've had really difficult emotional experiences, and that's hard. And I think there's a certain level of difficult emotional experience of which you need professional help and advice, and not a researcher talking about reflexive practice. So let's be clear about that. But I think it's those kind of more immediate levels of emotional or embodied. And embodied is something that's different for different people too. People have different levels of awareness of what's going on internally. I don't describe that in too much detail. It feels a bit too visceral to get into there. But people's experience and ability in that sphere varies a lot naturally. The research shows that. So I think those two levels are most difficult. Once you get beyond that, I think it's then a little easier to think about the rational and relational ones, to engage with those more simply.
That's really interesting. One comment that we've had come in relates to your presentation and how it can sit alongside tools like Myersbriggs, and that was something which I was quite interested in as I was hearing you talk, because Myersbriggs is something that I've done throughout my career. And what's your view on how those two concepts sit together?
Okay, well, I think they're very different things. I think what I'm offering you is a process and a way of engaging with a process to deliberately construct yourself and challenge yourself and maybe change your mind over time. Things like Myers-Briggs, I think, are useful on the level of being a conversation partner. That sounds like a strange thing, but they give you a portrait of yourself that isn't a full description of a person at all. So don't ever go and say, I am an INTJ or something like that. That's no description of the richness that is a human being, but it gives you a confrontation with a description of yourself that you can recognize or not. And from that, you can think about, actually, am I comfortable with that? How do I feel about that? What do I then do? So it has a useful role in the same way. And often lots of these things, Myers-Briggs, Enneagrams, a whole range of them give you that same kind of thing. They give you a conversation partner, offering you a different view of yourself that you can then think about and dialogue with and then make decisions about.
Terrific, thank you. We've got a really interesting question here from Robert. As a reflexive researcher, ideally one who has read your book, you might be attuned to noticing your reactions in the moment. How should leaders in organisational settings handle their own reactions and those of colleagues?
Oh, that's interesting, because research, particularly on leadership, tends to suggest that there's a need to prevent emotional contagion. So lots of the research focuses on that. So if you're in a leadership situation, especially in times of crisis, you would generally be asked and expected to control your emotions to keep things stable for others. And so try and offer reassurance in a stable situation. Now, that's okay up to some level, but it leaves people with a lot of processing to do afterwards. So people who've been through difficult situations, maybe involving violence in their organisation, have then had difficult processing to do afterwards by holding on to things and getting on with them while they're suppressing that emotion. So on the one hand, you will find situations in which you have to kind of lock it down. But if you're a reflexive practitioner, you know you've locked it down. You need to then know, I can't leave that. I've got to go and unlock it and speak with somebody and look at that and pay attention, especially if you feel like it's hurt you quite badly.
Really interesting. We've got another anonymous question, which is a terrific question. When a memory of a stressful situation is triggered, is this not a way of your brain or body dealing with it rather than suppressing it? In time, can this not lessen the original pain?
Well, it depends, actually, and I'm not a specialist in post-traumatic stress disorder, but for many people with PTSD, it doesn't lessen the pain, and they need help, and serious help. So please, if you think you might have PTSD, seek professional advice and not my advice at all. But often it just re-evokes it, and it's so horrible we push it down again. And sometimes I think even of situations like the death of a parent, if you've had that situation, I'm of an age when that's something I'm likely to have experienced, and so I have. There are situations that trigger that, and it isn't easy to deal with, but eventually you do. So I think you do need to get past it. So the being re-evoked, what that's really doing is it's giving you a warning systematically of saying, I recognise a danger your mind and body is telling you, and it's warning you something's happening. But sometimes it's triggered when the danger isn't present, or isn't present in the same way, or isn't present enough, and leads you to be overwhelmed by an emotion, stopping your normal reaction. So it's worthwhile thinking about what's going on for you, deciding whether you need to talk to somebody as a friend or as a professional if that's happening to you a lot.
Great response, thank you. Got a really great pertinent question from Steph. How can we apply reflexive practice to political discourse when there is such a lack of trust nowadays? Does the relational reception element break down in this context?
It can do, but the thing to ask yourself is, how am I challenging myself from the views I entertain? It doesn't mean to say that the views that are opposite than yours are right at all. It just means to say that, have I considered them and then made my decision? That's what should be asked of all of us. And so I make a point of reading various news sources. Sometimes it makes my blood boil even, but I want to see what's being said in different places. And often you might find that doesn't necessarily change your point of view, but be open to it and be ready to be surprised if that's the case. But always be aware if somebody from a different viewpoint is obviously not doing that. If somebody is just speaking in an echo chamber context and they aren't themselves engaging in dialogue with you, then you're not obliged to treat them as if they should be respected in dialogue. A dialogue means that both of us be ready to change our minds. So although I might benefit because I'm the person seeking dialogue, the likelihood is that both of us would learn something. And if you feel that's not a possibility in political discourse, then it's not really a fair exchange. It's not really an open-minded conversation, and that is required for dialogue. But instead, you can try and inform yourself from multiple sources and get the benefit of dialogue without being open to be somebody trying to persuade you and using rhetoric and other tools.
Super, thank you, Paul. You're clearly generating a lot of ideas and a lot of good debate or questions in our chat bar. So a few more for you to come if you can hang on for a few moments. Really interesting one from Lisa, who clearly is who knows the field a bit. How might your work relate to Anne Cunliffe's and also Alvison and Skolberg's reflexive methodology?
Okay, well, my work is very much connected to Anne Cunliffe's, and some of my own research has been with Anne Cunliffe. So two of my favourite publications are written with Anne Cunliffe as a partner, and I enjoyed that very much. So if you're in the tradition of working with Anne Cunliffe and her view on reflexivity, I'm pretty much the same place, although I'm not so far to radical reflexivity. For everyone else, Anne Cunliffe really gets to a point where we're constantly challenging and undermining ourselves and having to say there's no stable foundation. I think she may be right, but I think we can't go on that way. I try and stop at a level at which I can go on, rather than that reflexive undermining taking on a loop forever. Alvison and Skolberg are really about the philosophy of reflexive practice and reflexive methodology, and they're very much focused on research who want to unpack that set of philosophical levels. I think it's more difficult to engage with their work for that reason, and mine is deliberately more straightforward and applied towards practical application.
Super, thank you. We've got a new question from Ian from Northumbria University. I know it well. I used to work there many years ago. Ian says, thank you so much, Paul. You helped me think about how reflexive practice is a healthy alternative to amplifying feedback loops. But a question, do you think there is a bias towards talking it through as a way of resolving loops? I guess we have to think about it, think it through and articulate it, but I do wonder about embodied regulation.
That's a really good point, Ian, and I tend to emphasise that dialogue as a kind of a missed step for people in the way of getting out of it, but we can be more aware of those other signals and work with those. You're right. So if we are aware of our emotional embodied state and we then take that into the practice of realigning, perhaps if we have some experience of doing so, we can react differently. And I think Ian's own work, I think I know which Ian it is, speaks more powerfully to that than mine. So I wouldn't want to try and tread on his territory too much, but I absolutely agree. Yes, we can work at those different levels. So what I'm saying is, I think, is when we have a challenge on one level, be open to informing ourselves from the other. So it might not be that we need to inform our emotional reaction from the dialogical level. It might be we need to try and take it into rational, embodied, and decompose it that way. Just get some internal different perspectives. I don't think that answers your question properly, Ian, but it's probably the best I'm going to do.
Sounds like there are some good opportunities to carry on that conversation over a cup of tea if we were allowed to do such things in person.
You are.
Yeah, so this is a really good question coming up. So it's anonymous, I'm afraid I don't obviously know who it's from. How do you balance reflexive thinking without it moving towards decision paralysis in certain situations, especially for academic-minded people? How can one differentiate between helpful reflexive thinking and harmful rumination?
That's a really good point. And again, if you think you're in a harmful loop, get some professional help and don't rely on me. But if you're thinking about when should I apply reflexive practice, I say there's lots of our lives that are routine and ordinary. I'm not going to be applying reflexive practice when I'm making my breakfast in the morning, because I'm such a reliable routine. I have the same breakfast, exactly the same breakfast every day. I don't need to think about it. And there are lots of situations like that, like getting on the bus and you're buying a ticket, whole lots of your life it doesn't need, but recognize when something is different. That's when it's worthwhile noticing. So that difference might be spotted because you've got that strong emotional reaction, or because your contextualization isn't fitting it in properly, then send you to the other levels to look around. So look out for difference, and look out also for when the consequence of it might be important. So if your reflexive invitation is about a different kind of salad that you're looking at to have for dinner and you don't have any allergies, well, that's not a big decision. If it's about which career path should I take, then I'm going to think about my reflexive practice more often. So look for difference, look at the level of consequence that applies, and don't be afraid of using routine behaviour when it's something of no matter.
Terrific. This is a question which is not a million miles away from that. It's from Lorna. Your emphasis on reflecting on the emotional is relatively rare in the academy. Do you think emotions should be discussed more in academic research, whatever the discipline?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's such a part of the journey of being a researcher as well, all of our lives. And in fact, in most organisational contexts, we don't deal with emotion well enough and often enough. But yet it's so normal, isn't it? It is a part of every human life almost every day. I go through very few days when I experience no emotions, and I'd worry if that was the case. I'm not particularly of that kind of very calm, rational situatedness. Other people are a bit more than me. But yes, I think it's not attended to enough, and legitimating is actually quite helpful. Recognise that people will be in an emotional situation, and there's nothing abnormal about it. There's nothing odd about having emotions at work. There, I give you permission to have emotions at work. How's that?
Thank you. I'll take that permission. We'll see what happens next. Another question from Lisa. How do you teach reflexive practice?
Well, in the past, I've focused on several ways of doing it. The first way of thinking about this is to show people it's applying to some context that's not their own, because it can be quite threatening, the idea that you should change your mind about something. Most of all, we don't want to do that. So show people how it could have affected other people when they had the opportunity to make a decision and took a different path. So I might work with an interesting movie or an interesting book and give people an example of where people could have thought differently. So it could be a classic like a Jane Austen novel in which the character makes a certain judgment about a person. Think about Pride and Prejudice, in which Elizabeth gets it completely wrong about the two male protagonists. And why does she come to that decision? What's she thinking about there? All that kind of simple stuff. And then take people into their own experience to look back at what's happened for them. And is there anything that they feel they could unpack differently? And for almost all of us, there is. But start with something neutral and fictional and engage with it that way, and then move on to something closer to home and give people space and time and respect that you're asking them to share emotions. They don't have to if they're not comfortable.
I'll never read Pride and Prejudice again in the same light. I think you've given me permission to read it afresh and read it anew, I think. More of a comment from Peter rather than a question. Great talk, Paul, he says. I'm interested in the potential of your work for helping politicians make better decisions. Many have complicated life stories which drive them. I'm not sure they all have insight into those influences.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yes, thank you. But I think it applies to all of us, that our life stories have lots of learning for ourselves that we've not necessarily unpacked. When you present yourself in an organisation or in politics, it's the kind of the shiny neutral character, especially in politics. You're supposed to have no backstory and everything's been squeaky clean. Well, most people who have anything interesting to say or understand haven't had that experience. So I think that's a very good suggestion that's been made, that politicians reflecting on their own life stories will have different insights that are useful. And in fact, actually, even reflecting on their political lives, our own Stephen Gethins at St Andrews, written a very interesting book about his experience of working internationally as a member of a political party. And you can see about the tremendous learning he's had through interacting with different cultures and seeing what it means to be Scottish through different people's eyes, for example. Very interesting book.
Great, thank you very much. Question from Samantha. Do you have advice about judging whether to enter into dialogue with someone at the point of emotional reaction?
Yes, I think you want to make sure you're working with a trusted other at that point. If you feel you're emotional, you want to be in a safe context. So is somebody really comfortable with you being emotional? Will that surprise them? I have in the past had support from a lovely colleague another university who was there to talk to me when I needed someone to talk to, but I was too emotional and it was a bit of a shock for them. So make sure that the other person is going to be comfortable if that's the situation you're going with. Make sure that the trust is really there, and always stop the conversation if you're not comfortable. And people respect that. Think, oh, actually, no, you know what? I need to go away and think about this, I think, but thanks. So be ready to stop if you're not comfortable.
Good tip, thank you. Question from Robin. How is it best to interrogate the source, motivation and intention behind the information you're exposed to? i.e., why am I seeing or hearing this? Communication and the transfer of knowledge is multidirectional, so self-reflexivity requires empathic reflection as well.
Well, that's a very complex question to unpack, but I think what it takes us is from the area of self-reflexive to the area of critical reflexive. I'm going to judge what's offered to me as not being neutral. It never is. That's a fair comment. Everybody else is coming from somewhere too. But do I think the situation is such that they are offering it in good faith? Because that's different than if I think somebody's offering something with a particular motivation or a manipulative intention. They don't have to be having a manipulative intention to offer you something that's coming from their viewpoint. And that's why you're engaging with them. You want to see something different than you would otherwise see. So it's a very good point. Be aware of it. And be aware that you can be critical of their foundations, but expect them to be critical of yours right back. That's the point of it. We're trying to look and help each other to develop in that way.
Great. Two-way dialogue then, by the sounds of it, is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Another question from Nicole. Do you support the ideas of collective awareness of Jung?
Oh, I've only recently read something about Jung, and Jung is a very complex and specific approach to psychoanalysis. And I don't think I'm qualified to speak on it, to be honest. I have read up on it because I see why Nicole might think there's a connection. But I think, to be fair, when it's a specialised field like that, I should just say I'm not really qualified to speak on it, Nicole. I'm sorry.
Fair enough. You can't be an expert in everything in the world.
Or anything.
Really interesting question from, again, an anonymous one. This topic is new to me and has been very interesting. I especially like the idea of using reflexive practice to challenge and change yourself. Does Paul have some suggestions for additional literature on this topic?
Well, I've marketed the book already, but I think there's some good research papers you'd find. I'm trying to think of some generalist. I'm not quite sure the level at which you'd want to look at it, but if you look at the general research databases, they will show you that if you're a researcher and if that's your interest. My book will give you some pointers to general resources. I think Kim Etherington's written a generalist book that'd be useful as well. Work by Anne Cunliffe in the Journal of Management Education. That's also very accessible. So those might be some sorts which might look. I also love, and I think it's very accessible, Margaret Archer's work. She's a sociologist and a very famous sociologist. So it's not, fantastically easy stuff, but she deals a lot with people's life stories, and those are always very accessible and always help you to understand what's going on. So Margaret Archer might be another place to look.
Great, good tip, and a very nice thank you note from Ian from Northumbria as well, which is great. Another question from Lisa. Is this thematic about organisational emotions invoked by reflexive practice easy to write about? Perhaps you can answer this as an editor at AMLE. So maybe switching hats for a moment.
All right. Well, I think what you are driven to write about is the things that you think are important and can make a difference. So that's why I was writing and researching this area. I think anything that people want to write about is okay, as long as they do it to the best of their ability, they use methods that are appropriate for the purpose, and they write in a way that we can understand and follow and make a difference to the intended audience. So if you're writing for that particular journal, you want to help people involved in management education. So who are the audience you're trying to help and reach through a particular journal? Am I writing in a way that journal expects? And then you can really write on an appropriate topic. And certainly AMLE and other journals that are similar will handle and work on emotion that's fitting their mission.
Super stuff. Another anonymous question, which follows on, I think, from one that we had earlier. You mentioned that leaders need to be calm to prevent emotional contagion and to keep things stable. This can sometimes work against them as they can be branded cold or unresponsive. How should leaders achieve this balance and avoid being labelled cold or unresponsive, especially if they're only taking their job seriously and try and be professional and calm?
Yeah, well, I think it's a difficult conundrum, isn't it? I think there is lots to be said for admitting that we're all vulnerable and being vulnerable in leadership. I think sometimes people are okay these days that, somebody in a leadership position might cry, but not when they're looking for reassurance. So what's the situation I'm in? And sometimes it's difficult and it's hard to judge what to do. So it's never an easy answer. But I think it's okay to be vulnerable in situations where it won't upset other people. So again, it's about emotional contagion, but you want to be honest and authentic to yourself. And if you find in a leadership position you do happen to cry because the situation strikes you that way, I think most people will understand. And if you can still engage with people despite displaying emotion, then maybe that's okay. There's more work to be done in that, I think, really. I say it's the prior research, not mine, that talks about containing emotion in leadership. Lots of it is focused on that, though, and suggesting that the contagion can be a problem. But certainly, don't be ashamed of being vulnerable and obvious in that way, if that's who you really are, but show people that you're still able to help them as you work through it.
Terrific, thank you. I'm very mindful of time. We've only really got a few minutes left, so maybe we should start to wrap up with a comment and then a final question. Final comment from Ian at Northumbria. You've started me thinking about how the critical reflexivity and sense-making traditions speak to each other. I don't see enough on the intersection between the two. So it sounds like a new area of conversation there.
Absolutely.
And final question, I think, from Alistair. Where do you think might be the most promising spaces for dialogue within a university?
Oh, goodness. Anywhere and everywhere. We have opportunities for conversation throughout a university, and St Andrews is a great one because it's small enough that we can know a lot of people and we can interact with people who have very different disciplinary perspectives from ourselves. I think in a university, that's why I value most of all of a place like St Andrews, that I will be able to connect with people with different perspectives. So I can talk to that professor from physics and he can educate me in a certain way. I can talk to that professor from chemistry and she might have another view. I can talk to the art historian and we can develop different perspectives together. So I would say wherever it gives the opportunity for a different point of view around something you both care about, that's the place to have a conversation.
Sounds like a good place to end then, Paul. Thank you very much. And we've just got a final anonymous comment that says, wonderful, thank you. Oh. So I think that's a great summary of it. So finally, just to wrap up, I'd like to thank Paul very, very much indeed once again for sharing his research with us. It's been a terrifically enlightening evening. Paul's presentation will join the back catalogue of Saints Talks on the University of St Andrews Alumni YouTube channel. So please do check those out if you want to review tonight's presentation or indeed look at others that you may not have seen before. We're currently preparing next year's series, so look out for details as they become available. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we certainly wish you and Paul a very happy and healthy festive season. Good evening to you all.